broad brush approach to addressing these issues. And we want to ensure that there's some focus on the youth perspective, the youth needs, the youth concerns in the negotiation around these issues. So the activities that you will contribute to this afternoon, there's a little bit of homework to be done in the process. It's not just a into presenters, speakers that we'll have just now, begin to think about what are your specific asks as your country governments go into the negotiations. And I hope those breakout group discussions will be lively and rich to inform that process. We're also happy to be doing this pre-COP climate with some really great partners across the region who are themselves involved in climate justice work, climate empowerment work, and youth engagement at different levels. I want to acknowledge CANARI, Climate Tracker, and CYN, as well as the Breadfruit Collective, who are partnering with us in different ways this afternoon to make this conversation possible. And primarily, I would like to thank Open Society Foundations for having seen it fit to invest, I would say, or to fund this initiative to allow us to have this conversation today, and other initiatives that some of these groups are also leading. I want to also make mention of the fact that today we have launched the first in a series of conversations podcasts that are being hosted with podcaster Dana Lynn Swaby around the initiative which this conversation falls under. It's called the Caribbean Youth Climate Justice Coalition. And so the first in a series of podcasts was launched today. And I invite you to find us on social media, wherever we are, and give that a listen and provide us with some feedback as well. So we are doing a number of things, but today's conversation is about creating space for all of you. And so I want to take the opportunity to thank the individuals who are going to be contributing in different ways today. I want to thank the Honorable Joel Clark, Minister of Sustainable Development and Climate Action out of St. Kitts and Nevis. You'll hear from her in a little while. I also want to acknowledge our partner Design Billy from Climate Tracker, Dr. Ainka Granderson from CANARI, and the coordinators and youth leaders who you will be engaging with in the breakout groups. They will be facilitating those conversations with you. So I encourage you to relax, to use the chat and share and provide feedback and make this a very engaging exchange and exercise. Again, we want it to be an opportunity where you get a chance to have your say on COP27 and really help to shape the outcomes from that process. We want to believe that change is possible, but we have to first, create the opportunities to make that happen. I also want to acknowledge Kelly Kingman, who you will see doing graphic recording for us this afternoon. And so you will see, scribbles and drawings being done on a screen as Kelly captures graphically some of the key discussion points that will come out of the conversation today. All right, at this point, I would like to turn over to, actually, before I hand over to Dr. Clark, I want to invite those of you already here, if you haven't yet done so, to just drop in the chat the country that you're representing. So, let us know where you're from so we can get a sense of who is in the virtual room. So which country are you from this afternoon, or where you from? Full stop. And what is the one takeaway that you want from today's conversation? So where are you from, and what is the one takeaway that you want from the conversation? I'm not seeing any posts as yet, but I'm anticipating a flurry of those. Barbados, the US, Guyana, hi Janelle, hi Dr. Moody, St. Kitts. All right, we're seeing familiar names. Simone, hi Simone from Trinidad. Very happy to have you all join us, and very happy for the representation that I'm seeing in terms of the countries represented here. And so I want to point as well to the fact that when you occupy this space, very often, we do so, especially as activists and advocates, we do so mindful of the fact that we are representing a plethora of other communities that we're associated with, right? Whether directly or indirectly. And so we also look forward to hearing the stories and the experiences of other individuals and communities that you're a part of, even as we have these conversations today, right? So Trinidad, Antigua and Barbuda, great. Grenada, nice. Okay, so we have good representation from across the Caribbean. And in any case, at the end of this process, we anticipate some very rich outputs and outcomes, and we will be sharing those very widely so that we have, you know, a full coverage in terms of the reach of the outputs from the discussions this afternoon. So thank you very much, and I'm excited about what we're about to delve into. It's a little bit of work, not too much, but we want you to, you know, come prepared to also invest some brain matter into this process as we start to delve a little bit deeper, think a little bit harder and deeper about some of the issues that are coming up in the negotiations. Ivana shared her expectations. She's expecting to hear some of the practical actions and ideas that as SIDS we are addressing around climate change and climate justice. Great. And I think that maybe captures what a lot of persons are looking forward to hearing as well. All right, with that said, I am going to invite Dr. the Honorable Joel Clark, Minister of Sustainable Development and Climate Action in St. Kitts and Nevis, who has been championing climate action, climate justice, but more importantly, youth engagement in this process in all her work. And so we're very happy to see her, you know, operate, exist in this capacity, which allows her to continue to champion this cause. And this afternoon, we look forward to hearing a little bit about her reflections of what this process has looked like and will look like as it takes shape going forward into COP27. Dr. Clark, over to you. I believe you're muted.
Okay, so let's start again. Good evening, Aisha, and thank you very much for inviting me to join this session. I feel very honored. And I said earlier when I was muted that it's so comforting to see familiar names on the call and privately message everyone, and we all share the same excitement about being in this Caribbean pre-COP youth engagement space. And although technically I do not wear the title of youth, I proudly wear the title of a youth advocate, of creating spaces, not just as a technical person or consultant, but as a legislator and a member of parliament, a person who creates spaces where youth engagement is possible, in particular youth engagement around key issues such as climate change, climate action, climate justice, and today, climate governance. Thank you, Aisha and partners, for this invitation. I'm going to be very short, but I hope that at the end of this conversation, we have a little bit more faith and hope in climate governance across the Caribbean. Importantly, COTED, or CARICOM leaders for environment in particular, meet on Friday to finalize our agenda for COP27. And the basis of the agenda is loss and damage. And for those of us in the space, we understand that Caribbean islands in particular, we are hoping and we are insisting that loss and damage is a primary agenda item for COP27. Today, I was asked by an individual, what are you talking about tonight? And I said, I'm going to be talking about climate governance and youth engagement in particular, but it's about COP27. And he said, what are you going to COP27 to do? I said, we are all going to COP27 to ensure that when things happen in the Caribbean space, in the simplest way, when things happen in the Caribbean space, climate related disasters, we are able to access funds to cover the damages. And he said, well, why don't you ask for funds to to mitigate, to ensure that you're not vulnerable to the damages. And I said, well, we've done that, but we're recognizing that there is something else that needs to be added to the agenda, loss and damage. But importantly, I realized that there's still spaces where people need to understand why we had to COP, where young people need to be fully and thoroughly engaged in the discussion about COP27 and about climate change, climate action, climate resilience, and importantly, climate governance. As a politician, it's always important that you talk to issues which connect to people. And sometimes we forget that people care about just having sustainable livelihoods or having livable experiences. And with climate governance, I've recognized that it's important that climate action, especially youth engagement around climate action, frames the political landscape and frames the conversation about policy development and legislation. And it's happening. Now, some of the key issues that we need to keep on the agenda for climate governance, we have to always remember that 1.5 to stay alive and our Paris Agreement. We have to ensure that the political framing and political conversations are around the three C's, the threat of climate change, COVID-19, and conflict, and how these three things always impact on what the political language or the political landscape across the Caribbean. Importantly, there's a need when you're thinking about climate governance to twin the digital revolution with climate response. And the digital revolution is linked completely to youth engagement. Youth, young people are our innovators. And if we don't engage young people in this space, in the space of policy and politics and legislation, and allow them the freedom to innovate, then we aren't really speaking about climate governance. There's also politicians and governance, and we need to remember also the need to think about the vulnerable groups, the groups that climate justice, the groups who we have to champion climate justice for, the differently abled, women, young people, the elderly, the LGBTQ plus population, the transient populations, the migrants. These people often are lost through the cracks of planning and policy development and in the governance agenda when we do not think of how climate change impacts these groups. Additionally, I think it's important in terms of governance that we always think of linking key sectors with climate resilience planning. I'm happy, having entered this space, that more and more you're hearing conversation about climate resilience planning. Importantly, climate action for me is in the center of it all, and around it are issues such as food security, water security, energy security, health, innovation, and the orange economy. And linking all of these sectors is youth. How do they feel about these issues? What are their conversations about innovation and the digital revolution and climate change and climate action? How do they see the future? What are their thoughts about the green transition? What are their thoughts about energy security, about the LGBTQ plus community? What are their thoughts about creating systems where vulnerable people are no longer vulnerable to climate change, to disasters? We have to always, as politicians, as legislators, create spaces where young people are able to just have a seat at the table, take up space at the table, and really share their opinions, share their ideas. And as I close, I want to focus on youth and climate justice, because this really is a context of youth engagement around climate governance. It has to be experiential, it has to be intersectional, it has to focus on justice, it has to be action-oriented, innovative, participatory, and youth-led. Experiential. Exactly what's happening in your life is what you need to use to fuel the ideas that will change current circumstances. Intersectional. I always use this term intersectional, and I'm very happy that more and more people are recognizing that the multi-layered existence that we have, that's the beauty of our realities, that we can see the world through different lenses. We can see the world as a rural youth. We can see the world as a young person. We can see the world and innovation as an LGBTQ plus person, and we can understand the varying complexities of having that intersectional reality. When it comes to justice, young people must always champion the cause for the most vulnerable amongst us, especially the most vulnerable who have the most extreme experiences to climate-related disasters. And in terms of action, if we don't have collective, intentional responses to climate justice, then we are not solving this. And how do we have collective, intentional responses to climate change? We engage young people. Innovation. I've been saying for a very long time that the audacity of youth is really important when it comes to finding innovative solutions to climate change. If we don't engage young people, listen to their ideas, listen to their stories, their what ifs, we're not going to get very far. And that's why conversations like this that Aisha and her team have put on are so critical in terms of framing that narrative for when we head to COP27. And participatory. Of course, we're now talking about the benefits of private-public partnerships, of the need to engage the private sector, to have initiatives and practices led by the private sector but regulated by the government. And another critical component of this partnership is young people. We must create spaces where young people can engage, young people can comment, young people can debate, young people can share, the youth can share their ideas, and what they think works can be incorporated in our policies. And finally, I want to stress again the importance of youth. We don't want to wait until we're in our 40s to say, what if we gave young people more opportunities? What if we gave young people more spaces to speak, to talk, to debate, to legislate? We don't want that. So heading into COP27, it must be youth-led. The agenda must be directed by what young people in this conversation, in this space, say is important. And that's why I'm happy to have been invited to give these very brief remarks.
We need climate justice,
engagement, and climate governance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clark. I think it's okay to say, sorry, I'm not understanding that screen. I think it's safe to acknowledge that beyond my affiliation with Dr. Clark as a colleague and you know, practitioners in this space, we're good friends. And I acknowledge that simply because I'm very proud, you know, to see you again operate at this level and in this space and bring such authenticity and appreciation for the realities that you too live and have lived and so fully understand. And I think your example and your story also speaks to the importance of engaging youth right where you are as young people, you know, despite not fully understanding some of these issues and concepts, but seeing the opportunity to begin to mold the minds, mold the behaviors, the mindsets, the perceptions, and develop an appreciation for, you know, the processes and the systems that get you to then be in a position such as the one Dr. Clark is in, or in similar positions at other levels where you have the wherewithal and the authority to then shape decisions and outcomes and legislations and policies that reflect the truth that you know also hold on to. Because Dr. Clark, I believe you exist not just as someone who is a professional and a career politician, but someone who fully lives the reality of an intersectional life and an appreciation for the vulnerabilities of different communities, and see the need to advocate for that in all the work that you do. And so we thank you for taking the time to share those comments with us. I see a question here. I don't want to put you on the spot. I see a question from Sarah, who said, if there's time for questions, and Dr. Clark, please feel free to indicate if you don't feel, you know, fully off with the issue here at hand to give a response, but I will still pose it. She says, it would be quite wonderful to hear about how the Escazú Agreement can be used as a tool for this purpose, and what actions parliamentarians can take for those on the front lines as human rights defenders of the environment. Sarah, thank you. A very good question. I'm going to invite Dr. Clark, if she is so inclined, to give a response to that. Dr. Clark, if you so see fit.
Thank you, Aisha. Oh, that's a wow, Sarah, thank you. All right, so the Escazú Agreement, essentially, we're trying to tackle environmental challenges in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I'll stop there to say it's important when we recognize that our grouping is not just Caribbean islands, but we also have to take in Latin America and the Caribbean. The important thing about this agreement is that we are trying to create a healthy environment that would be critical for peaceful, inclusive, and sustainable societies. And what I said earlier, if you put climate change in the center of critical economic pillars or critical development pillars, and even in the center of critical agreements that we have signed on to or are in the process of ratifying in the Caribbean, then you'll recognize that everything can be twinned with how we respond to climate change. So the Escazú Agreement in particular, for its orientation towards the environment, can also be connected to what we need to do to create more resilient societies, a more resilient environment to climate change, even if it includes engineering, so that, well, you know, the path of mitigation and adaptation, to ensure that we have that environment based on the tenets of the agreement to create peaceful, inclusive, and sustainable and climate resilient societies. I hope that helps.
Thank you so much. I believe it does, right, Sarah? And I think in support of that, I will add that if our countries ratify the agreement, Sarah, it supports the efforts to really give, you know, all citizens the opportunity to participate in decision making, to access information, and to access justice, not just in climate oriented engagement, but more broadly environmental work. And so that is the real crux of the matter. But I believe in the Caribbean, what has happened so far is that where some countries have signed on, they've not ratified. And so we are not seeing the full enforcement, you know, of the agreement. And that's part of why these conversations become necessary. So people know what is at stake and how they can get leverage the information that they have for more powerful outcomes, really. So on that note, because Dr. Clark really set us up with a fulsome understanding of the kind of broader framework of what is being said and done around the negotiations and leading up to COP27. But I believe that sometimes we still are left with this question of what is the COP? You know, and so we're going to invite climate trackers, Dizan Billy, who is very well placed to help us with this as a staunch COPite, to break down for us what the UNFCCC COP process is. Dizan?
Hi, everyone. Can you see my screen and can you hear me? Just confirm.
Yes, we can see and we can hear.
All right. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Dizan, as Aisha would have pointed out, and I'm from the Caribbean team at Climate Tracker. I'm really excited to be here and to tell you a little bit about COP. And the reason I say a little bit is because if we try to cover COP and the UNFCCC will, in its entirety, we might be here until COP starts, right, which is on November 6th this year. So I'll try my best to break it down into very digestible portions. Before I get into it, though, I just want to give you some context as to Climate Tracker and so that you know where I'm coming from. All right, so what is Climate Tracker? Basically, we're an international nonprofit organization, and we aim to support, train, and incentivize climate journalism globally. We believe in the power of journalism. We believe in the power of storytelling to help people understand the big technical, scientific knowledge that's out there, you know, and information that's out there. Ironically, we also recognize that the challenge of climate journalism is often greatest in countries that are hardest hit by climate change. And that's why we partner with organizations around the world to fill those gaps and to act as a springboard for climate and environmental journalists to tell stories that so desperately need to be told, right? So how do we do this? Basically, we provide trainings and fellowships for young journalists. We conduct action-oriented media research. We fund young journalists to attend big events like COP. And we also support global collaborations between journalists and newsrooms and NGOs around the world. And I'm really happy that this year, the Caribbean Climate Tracker team specifically has experienced big growth, and that just, it makes my year, to be honest. We've had projects surrounding energy transition, citizen climate journalism, and climate justice, and we've had told the Caribbean story that is so undercovered out there. All right, so I'll jump straight into the meat of the matter of what the UNFCCC is in a nutshell, because like I said, if I try to speak about it, we'll be here for ages, right? So over the past 40 years, basically, climate change was identified as a global problem by the world, right? It was announced that it was this announcement basically that led to the development of a system of governing bodies who would try to address the issues through climate diplomacy. And this is what contributed to the creation of what we now know as the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change, also called the UNFCCC or the UNFCCC. Right now, it's under the UN world. If you're involved in it, you know that there are just a lot of acronyms. There are a lot of big technical terms that mean something really simple. But the UNFCCC, basically, it's an international environmental treaty, right? It was founded in 1992, and the basic objective is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. That, in a nutshell, is what the UNFCCC is supposed to be doing. All right, so let's try to understand now, how does it work? Right, the UNFCCC basically has governing bodies, which are at this basically the supreme decision makers for the different treaties. And the COP is the decision-making body for the UNFCCC convention. Right now, under the UNFCCC, you have the COP, you have the CMA, and you have the CMP. Right now, I'll go a little bit into the details of it, just a little bit, right, a little further on. But the COP, the CMP, and the CMA are basically hosted annually. And what we hear, the term that we hear passing around is COP, right? And COP is basically the common name used for the promotions of that annual meeting. Now, the actual name of the meeting actually includes all three governing bodies. So it's actually this year, for instance, it's COP27, CMP17, and CMA4, right? So that's basically the governing bodies of the UNFCCC. And basically, the COP refers to the Conference of Parties, and the parties are basically those countries that are signed on to the UNFCCC. All right, you have the CMA, the CMP, which refers to those parties that are signed on to the Kyoto Protocol, and then you have the CMA, which are those countries that are signed on or serving as parties serving at the meeting of the parties of the Paris Agreement. Right now, underneath the COP, the CMP, and the CMA, you have what is known as the subsidiary bodies. You have two main ones, which is what people call the SABSTA, and the SBI, right? Now, the SBI, it refers to the subsidiary body of implementation, and the SABSTA refers to the subsidiary body for scientific and technical or technological advice, right? Now, basically, these two subsidiary bodies, they assist the governing bodies in different issues. With regards to the SABSTA, they refer to, or they carry out methodological work under the COP, CMP, and CMA, right? And they promote collaboration in the field of research, systemic observation of the climate system, and so on. And the SBI supports the implementation of issues under the governing bodies using instruments such as transparency, mitigation, adaptation, finance, right? So it really aims to enhance the ambition of parties on all aspects of the agenda. All right, so all of these different bodies that I've mentioned form the UNFCCC governing bodies, right, which at the end are the supreme decision makers for the different treaties. Now, another thing that's important to know with regards to the COP is that there are different types of actors who can actually attend meetings. You can't just say you're gonna fly to Egypt and go into the event. It doesn't work that way, right? You have different levels of access that happen. So for instance, there's the delegates. The delegates come from countries who are parties to the convention, to the UNFCCC. They are generally called parties, and they wear a pink badge. So you will find that that's the party badge, as they call it, and they have access to basically almost everything. And that is the badge that people really want to get, right? You want to be on the delegation. You want to have a party badge. You want to see all the action happening. Then you have the observers, right? So these are other organizations. It could be from an NGO, a company, a city, a civil-based organization, and they are organized in different groupings, which is called the constituencies, right? For example, the youth, farmers, women, industry, and these all form the observers, or they're all observers, and they wear a yellow badge. And then you have the orange badge, which is used by press or media, right? So these are the journalists from around the world that actually come to the COP to cover the event, cover the climate conference, and all the different meetings that are happening at the same time. Like I tell our fellows, like right now we're training a group of fellows from around the world to go and report on COP this year. And like I tell them, you never really understand the intensity of a COP until you reach there and you see how many things are happening at the same time, so it's just it can be overwhelming. And so basically there are several types of meetings that take place at COPs as well, with different people allowed to attend, like I mentioned, right? And the UNFCCC Secretariat actually makes decisions based on the consensus of all the parties. Different meetings that if you go to the UNFCCC website and you look at the agenda, you'll see there are different types of meetings. There are plenaries, which can be attended by parties, observers, media, right? You have informal meetings, you have ministerial meetings. There are different types of meetings, and they all just kind of happen at the same time. But what we want to pay attention to is the negotiating, what comes out of the negotiating meetings. All right, that's what we really need to pay attention to. Now, while each party is allowed to negotiate individually, parties generally work through groupings to establish a common negotiating goals, right? Or to strengthen their positions. Because, for instance, if I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, if Trinidad and Tobago was to go and try to put its priorities out there alone, it would not make a difference, right? But Trinidad and Tobago is a part of AOSIS, which is the Alliance of island states, right? So of small island states. So that is a negotiating body. So what you would find is that the parties, they all come and form different groupings called negotiating bodies, and they have their specific agendas that they go. I'm really sorry if my dogs are making a lot of noise. That they go with their agenda and what they want to put forward at each of these meetings. All right, so now here you would see some of the different groups. You have the umbrella group, which is mostly developed countries and some middle income economies as well, right? You have the European Union. The EU at COP also conducts climate negotiations as a group. It also reports its greenhouse gas emissions as a group to the UNFCCC, and that actually makes the EU a big emitter after China and the US, right? So through the commitment to become climate neutral by 2050, the EU has actually been a leader in many ways. But if you get down to the nitty-gritty of it, there are a lot of different opposing agendas as well. All right, so I can't go into it because, like I said, we'll be here forever. Then you have the EIG, right, which is the environmentally interested group. I think it's the name of, I can't remember. It's so many different acronyms. I think it's the environmentally interested group or something like that. And this group basically contains a couple countries, which is mostly, you'll mostly hear like Switzerland is one of these countries. You mostly hear Switzerland being the frequent spokesperson for this group. And it often takes up positions close to the umbrella group. It's strongest when demanding that emission reductions in developing countries must be independently verified by international auditors. That's one of their big agenda points as well. Right, then you have the G77 plus China, which is the biggest group, and it consists of 134 countries, right? The G77 in China includes all developing countries with a number of members now well above the original 77, right? It is a fairly amorphous group with lots of differences among its members. It has stuck to a common position on critical issues such as the need for climate finance from rich nations. Apart from that, various countries and blocs within that group often articulate very different points on specific issues, right? So you would find that happens within G77 plus China. Right, and then you have a whole couple others. You have ALBA, you have BASIC, which is Brazil, South Africa, China, India. You have the like-minded group of developing countries, which is the LMDCs. And basically that group is a shifting band of more than 20 countries, which has been seen as a stumbling block by many others. So they're just a couple different groupings. And I'll go a little bit into AOSIS a little bit more because that's where that's where the Caribbean falls for the most part, right? So the AOSIS is the Alliance of Small Island States, and it has always had a strong presence in climate negotiations, pointing out that the survival of these countries is at stake as sea levels rise due to global warming. This group, the AOSIS group, has been very instrumental in making the 1.5 to Stay Alive campaign a big deal at these COPs. It has been instrumental in making the 1.5 ceiling an aspirational goal in the Paris Agreement. So at times you would find that AOSIS can sometimes align with the EU to push for stronger emission reduction actions by all countries. At times you might see it might align a little bit with BASIC as well. But it's the Small Island Developing States, that's the coalition. And that is where you would find leadership from the Caribbean specifically. And then you'll also find a lot of leadership from Pacific Islands within that space as well. All right, so these are some of the groupings that you can probably keep an eye out for. And I'll go a little bit into some more COP history as well, because I don't want to bore you. I want some key takeaways to actually happen from this little discussion. Now, the Kyoto Protocol was from COP5, right? The Kyoto Protocol is basically a UN protocol intended to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 5.2% below 1990 levels by 2012. In reality, global emissions soared past 40% from 1990s to 2009. I think it's 192 countries, parties ratified the Kyoto Protocol. And that was kind of like a very strong foundation, or well, strong, but it was a foundational element of the rest of years of negotiations that took place, right? And I'll go straight to the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is an implementation modality basically within the UNFCCC to help achieve the UNFCCC's objectives. The Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015, and it is by far considered to be the most ambitious agreement in the history of climate negotiations. Some of its main objectives include holding, and I'll quote, holding the increase in global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5, right? That's how it was stated in 2015. Another main objective was to increasing the ability to adapt to adverse impacts of climate change and making finance flows consistent. So that is some key points on the Paris Agreement. We can have a whole different presentation on the Paris Agreement. I don't know, Aisha, if we're ready to go into that, but here's some really quick points. It entered into force on the 4th of November, 2016. It has been ratified by 191 countries. And there are certain points that I really want to pull out from the Paris Agreement, from the COP, that we need to, when we hear it, we need to know what it refers to, right? So first of all, I want to pull out the nationally determined contributions, right? That is part of Article 3. And basically the nationally determined contributions, or the NDCs, are one of the key mechanisms of the Paris Agreement. They are the national plans that countries have to submit regularly to communicate their ambition to fight climate change. Right now, the plans can include information on the work being done on mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation. Those plans have to be submitted regularly every 5 years and should represent progression. You should see ambition. You should see progression in climate ambition as you submit your NDCs every time it needs to be submitted, right? And then there's the global stocktake. All right, now the global stocktake, which is scheduled for 2023, basically will consist of 3 main parts: the information collection, technical assessment, and consideration of outputs. The thematic areas that will be discussed include mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation. All right, implementation and support, but also can consider issues related to response measures and loss and damage. All right, so these are some key terms to take note of going into understanding the COP as well. Market mechanisms is another big one. It's something that has caused a lot of contention within negotiations for the past couple of years. And basically, that's Article 6 is what it's known as. And it really, it's all this one is all about looking at things like carbon capture and that sort of stuff, right? So loss and damage is a big one. I think I heard Aisha mention this one as well, and it's a big point as well for small island states. So it's something that you would hear AOSIS countries making. I want to say noise, but good noise. They'll be making a lot of good noise about at COP27, because you will find that the AOSIS countries are not backing down on this loss and damage financing facility, which is basically financing to deal with the loss and damages that countries are already facing, right? Because of climate change. So that is something to keep an eye out for as well. All right. And then, of course, you will hear a lot about climate mitigation and climate adaptation. Basically, you can see that climate mitigation is when you're referring to avoiding and reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, right? So that's what you'll find more of the developed countries might be looking at that, whereas you will find a lot of developing countries looking at climate adaptation and focusing on climate adaptation, which means that they're looking for finance to deal with the things that already happen and to put things in place to deal with the things that they know will happen. All right, so it's a lot. It's a lot happening all at once, but it's very important as well for us to understand how this impacts our lives, how this impacts these decisions that are taking place all the way in Egypt, or last year all the way in Glasgow. You know, at the end of the day, it comes down to policies nationally and how it will affect our lives, but also how what is done in other countries will done or not done, meaning climate action or climate inaction, and the effects that will have on our lives at the end of the day, right? So if we're looking at the the COP26. So it's important to understand your history, to understand your future. Right now, what happened in COP26? Basically, the nations that came together, they adopted the the Glasgow Climate Pact. All right, and the Glasgow. There's so many different terminologies. The Glasgow Climate Pact. What it does is it aims to turn the 2020s into a decade of climate action and support. You would find that what you will hear is that a lot of people are referring to this COP in Egypt as the COP of implementation. And it's basically the start of that climate action, that actually taking what was said and putting it into action. And that's why you would find that a lot of the developing countries will put pressure on that element of the Glasgow Climate Pact, right? And what did it do? Basically, it was a package of decisions consisting of a range of agreed items, including strengthened efforts to build resilience to climate change, to curb greenhouse gases, and to provide the necessary finance for both. Nations did reaffirm their duty to fulfill the pledge of providing that $100 billion annually from developed to developing countries, and they collectively agreed to work to reduce the gap between existing emission reduction plans and what is required to reduce emissions. So that the rise in global temperature can be limited to 1.5 degrees. Also notably, for the first time, nations were called upon to phase down unabated coal power and inefficient subsidies for fossil fuels. So that's something to note as well. And as a part of the pact, nations also completed the Paris Agreement's rulebook as it relates to market mechanisms and non-market approaches, and transparent reporting on climate actions and supports provided or received, including for loss and damage. So that is something, those are some points to take into consideration from COP26. And like I said, COP27, what it's going to focus on a lot is implementation. Implementation will be the name of the game this COP. So I hope that helps to provide some context for you going into COP, which kicks off on the 6th of November. And I will pass it back to Aisha.
Thank you so much, Dizan, for a very thorough yet concise presentation, because I know there's a lot more that could be said about COP because it is that big and that complex. I listened to you present and I was reminded of a time when I was a younger youth at my first COP, and I was completely bowled over by the technicalities of COP. You know, and all of these acronyms and abbreviations and jargons. But what was most striking was that the young people from the global north were very conversant in all these terms, like they know these things inside out. And I thought to myself even then that I want young people in the Caribbean to know this thing in this way, you know. And so I believe that we've made significant strides in that. And Climate Tracker, I believe, is to be thanked for really supporting that, you know, retooling and education of climate activists in the Caribbean. And I hope that we will continue to see the enhancement of knowledge in that regard. But thank you. And I know it was a bit of a task for you to try and condense it into that presentation, but I think that was very rich and very useful. Ryan, I see you posted here that you have a question for Dizan. I'd like you to unmute and ask that question. Or Rayan, I'm sorry. I'd like you to unmute if you can and ask that question, Rayan. If you can't, then you can always type it in the chat, Rayan. All right, and I feel like people are keyed in and really listening, and this is some heavy technical stuff, but it can't be all handstands and backflips. You know, sometimes we have to kind of grind our teeth into the not so exciting part of the conversation to really understand what is happening, because COP and this UNFCCC process is really a big deal. Ryan, I'm not seeing anything from you as yet. I'm not hearing you as yet. Do we need to unmute Rayan Dizan, or can Rayan unmute?
Let me try. Yeah.
All right, we in preparation for next speaker, who is Dr. Ainka Granderson of Canary. So Dizan would have set the stage in terms of what is COP and what are some of the broad negotiation priorities and themes for COP and the UNFCCC process. But we're going to hear from Dr. Granderson about the specific priorities for some of the CSO groups, or specific priorities proposed so far by CSOs in the Caribbean, because in the grand scheme of things, as big and convoluting as this COP issue is, we recognize that the priorities across the regions are not the same, because climate change is not impacting countries in all the same way, or not all countries are being impacted in the same way. And so the realities and priorities of countries will differ. And we want to hear what some of those priorities are for the region. Before we hear from Dr. Granderson, though, I would like to ask or support person John James to play for us the climate justice jingle that was produced by Caribbean Youth Environment Network, who are supporters and partners in this initiative. And I want to acknowledge Mr. Reginald Burke, leader of that team, who is on the call today, and CYN have been staple leaders in this youth engagement, youth environment, and climate change movement in the Caribbean. John, are you able to play that just now? They've been doing a lot of work around climate justice as well, and they produce a jingle, and we just want to give it a listen at this point, and we'll hear it again throughout the conversation if possible. I'm not hearing anything from John just yet. Right, while John addresses that, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Granderson, who is going to present for us a snapshot, I believe, of what some of the Caribbean CSO priorities are. And again, I'm asking that as you listen to these priorities being outlined, that you give consideration to maybe more youth-specific versions of these priorities, because we're not assuming that these priorities will necessarily capture the youth, issues and concerns and vulnerabilities, and so, or capacities, let me add that. And so if they need to be further distilled to better represent what you think are youth concerns going into COP27, then please, use them as the basis or the starting point for building on and building out the recommendations that you will make. So Dr. Granderson, over to you.
Thanks for that introduction, Aisha. Really appreciate the opportunity to participate in what I think is the first of its kind regional kind of event, bringing together youth to really talk about pre-COP and what are some of the conversations we need to be having. Good night or good afternoon, depending where you're joining us from. I'm joining from Trinidad and Tobago, and I've been tasked, as I just said, with sharing some of the civil society sort of perspectives and priorities looking towards COP27 from the Caribbean region. So let me just pull up my slides. I will try to be like Dizan, give some really good ideas, but also try to be concise, so that we can get to the more fun part, which is having the breakout group discussion. So for just a little bit of background, for those of you who may not be familiar with the group that I work with, the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute, Canary for short, we are a regional, independent, technical nonprofit that's based in Trinidad, that works all across the region. And our mission is really to promote stakeholder participation and stewardship of natural resources across the Caribbean for equitable, sustainable, and resilient development. And we focus on a number of areas, from biodiversity and ecosystems to equity and justice to governance issues, as well as resilience. And that's the area of work that I lead. And so in doing that, we really focus on building the resilience of vulnerable communities, their livelihoods, and the ecosystems that we all depend on to climate change and other disasters, and really looking at how we can better promote climate justice over the last couple of years. And to really catalyze the work that we've been doing, we're actually embarking on an initiative to get this Caribbean Climate Justice Alliance going, which we've been doing in collaboration with Panos Caribbean and a number of other allies, including Climate Tracker, Girls Care, YPAC, and others, with funding from the Open Society Foundations. And so this alliance really aims to bring together what are now some of those more smaller and often disconnected efforts by different civil society organizations, so it's NGOs, community-based organizations, different grassroots networks, as well as other non-state actors like academics, the creative arts, media, individual activists, to really leverage the synergies, enhance knowledge sharing, and really have joint actions. We have a strong regional voice and movement around climate justice issues. And really that's what we're aiming to do, really aiming to amplify our voice so we can really call for climate justice linked to economic justice, environmental justice, and social and racial justice, and really focus on the most vulnerable people in the region that are on the front line of the impacts from the climate crisis. And so since we launched this alliance in March, we actually have on board over 20 allies, and they're doing some really innovative work on climate justice from grassroots to regional levels, including with youth. And we're really looking forward to having others join us in this. And I'm very excited actually to hear the kind of statement that comes out from today from our Caribbean youth. And I think in particular, for today's session, what I'm actually going to share is some of the priorities that we've come up together with the allies. So this is not Canary's ideas of what are the civil society priorities and perspectives, but this is actually the joint priorities that have come out from a series of dialogues that we've been having with this group since May of this year, that's brought together, I think, over 75 different groups and activists to really discuss what are some of the key needs and priorities for action around climate justice and what we want to see at COP27 and beyond. And we actually have a COP27 statement that we're hoping to release later this week in time to influence what's happening at the upcoming CARICOM negotiators meeting. There's also the big G20 meeting, and obviously COP27 is starting in a couple of weeks. So that's the idea. And so, we really recognize that COP is a pivotal moment. We need bold action that really takes into account the science that keeps telling us that we've, gone past 1 degree Celsius of warming of the global temperature. We're on track for dangerous levels of warming well beyond 2 degrees Celsius. And we really need to have some decisive action to avoid the most devastating impacts and really support Caribbean islands and other developing countries to shift to more just and resilient development pathways. And so we're really calling for 5 priority areas for action at COP27 around reducing the emissions and really keeping 1.5 to stay alive. Also scaling up locally led and ecosystem-based solutions that really focus on what's happening on the ground and empowering local communities and those on the front lines to take action. Also improving access to climate finance, and really ensuring that we have a whole of society approach to action. Also looking at that loss and damage issue, which I think both our opening speaker, Dr. Clark, as well as Dizan have mentioned is a key issue and is really high on the agenda at COP. And so we really need to look at how we can make sure that we have the adequate finance for this, but also we're operationalizing the networks that need to be put in place so this
Look here! Look, listen! Stop it. So stop giving fucking advice you know nothing about.
Yeah, so sorry about that. And so then the fifth priority that we were looking at was also supporting a just transition and really looking at how we can promote more purple, inclusive, sustainable, and resilient development. So I'll go into a little bit more detail about each of these priorities so you can have a sense of what we're talking about around each of these. So firstly, we're calling for obviously emissions need to be rapidly reduced to limit global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And this really is about action by the world's largest economies and emitters, especially what they call the G20 countries, which are some of the most developed kind of economies that account for 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So if we can just get those countries to actually do something significant, we can actually have a very big impact on our emissions. And so what we're actually talking about here is asking the G20 to stop subsidizing fossil fuel industry, which is obviously a big driver of emissions in all of these countries, but also looking at their nationally determined contributions, which I think Design did a good job of explaining, are the pledges basically that we've made about how we're going to reduce our emissions. And they need to ensure that those are actually aligned with the pathway of getting us to 1.5 degrees Celsius goal and not overshooting that. Currently, the pledges that we have are putting us on a pathway to go well over 2 degrees Celsius by 2100. And so this would have obviously catastrophic consequences for our islands. And so we really need them to commit to realigning and also committing to net zero, what they call net zero emissions by 2050. So that means that you might see some slight increases here and there, but net zero overall emissions of net zero declining by 2050. And so we need the G20 to really step up here, but obviously other countries also need to commit to reducing their emissions and being consistent with that 1.5 degrees Celsius goal, or we are going to overshoot it. And so that's really an urgent sort of priority. The second one that we have then is looking at scaling up support for what we call locally led and ecosystem-based solutions for adaptation and building resilience at the local level. And this includes really looking at how we can empower local actors, including Indigenous peoples, people from Afro-descendant communities, other frontline communities, local resource users like small-scale farmers and fisherfolk, community enterprises, to really have a voice in the decisions that directly affect their lives and livelihoods, and to design and implement their own solutions in partnership with government and private sector. And we also want to see a scaling up and integrating of ecosystem-based solutions, recognizing that if we invest in conserving, sustainably managing, restoring our natural ecosystems, this actually provides us with multiple benefits in terms of building ecological resilience, economic resilience, and social resilience. And we also have mitigation, what they call co-benefits, because while they're building resilience, they're also helping to capture carbon emissions and actually reducing our emissions by doing things like restoring our forests and mangroves. And our ecosystems are valuable in and of themselves and need to be protected. So that's also a really important reason for looking at these ecosystem-based solutions. And so some of the specific needs that we've heard from people is really thinking about how we can support people to better assess their own vulnerability, how we can look at how we integrate local and Indigenous knowledge, looking at capacity building and financing, but also creating more enabling sort of policy environments to support these types of solutions. Another big thing, and this was mentioned already as well, is obviously money. We need to get more climate finance, and we need to make sure that the money is getting where it matters. And so our islands are investing in adaptation, in mitigation, in building resilience, but we need a lot more financial and technical support to really deliver the reductions in emissions that we've pledged to, but also to adapt and build our resilience to what are basically the unavoidable impacts of climate change that's already locked in based on the emissions that have already occurred. And so we really want to demand that, the wealthy developed countries really make good on that pledge that Dizan mentioned of 100 billion US annually from 2020 through to 2025 to really support us, as developing countries, to address the impacts that we're seeing and to reduce our emissions. And in addition to this, we actually need a roadmap in place at COP27 for what we're going to go do beyond 2025, because we're actually already very close to 2025 and negotiations take a long time. So while we're making sure we actually hit that 100 billion goal, we also need to start talking about, well, what's the new climate finance goal beyond 2025? How are we actually going to raise the trillions of dollars that many countries have estimated they need to really address the climate crisis? And I have here a few bullets which actually meant to hone in on a couple of things. So in scaling up finance, we talk a lot about the amount, but it's also important to think about the quality of that finance. And a big message, I think, that's coming from civil society is that we need grants, not loans, but grants. And we need finance that's predictable, that's patient, and that's transparent. We also need mechanisms put in place to ensure that these funds are channeled to the local level to meet the needs of the most vulnerable and marginalized groups, and that we're really building resilient local livelihoods and local ecosystems and natural resources. I think it's also important that we also think about how we're financing and building the capacity of these groups on the ground, from local communities to the NGOs and different grassroots networks that support them so they can do the critical work that they need to do to support adaptation and to build resilience alongside governments and the private sector. And actually one of the key asks that we have for COP27, so this is CANARI, the allies, but also other NGOs across the globe who are also very much advocating on this issue, is that we're lobbying for at least 25% of total finance for adaptation being earmarked for the local level. And this includes ecosystem-based solutions, and that this is actually getting to those on the front lines and other local actors in the Caribbean islands and other developing countries to support their action. And so this would actually, if we use the 100 billion target, work out at about 15 billion per year that's specifically earmarked to going to the local level and supporting efforts by groups like us to do climate action. Continuing on that idea of finance, as I said before, loss and damage is a big issue that has really been ignored at the last few COPs. We got a little bit of traction last year at Glasgow, but we really needed to be top of the agenda in Egypt. And, it's really important because when we think about things like this year alone, we had the devastation from Hurricane Ian in Guadeloupe. So this picture is from Guam and Guadeloupe, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and other parts of the Caribbean. There's also severe flooding in Pakistan, Nigeria, other countries, and there's drought in the Horn of Africa. So there's all these significant extreme events happening that are causing a lot of widespread damage and devastation. And how are we going to address this? Is it fair that developing countries get into debt trying to respond to these issues when they've contributed the least to the problem? So one of the big things is setting up a finance facility to really provide dedicated, but also additional finance for loss and damage, which is separate from the money that we've been talking about for mitigation, for adaptation, for building resilience. This is separate and apart just for when you face a massive climate event, like a huge hurricane or massive drought, that there's funds there to help you recover from that. And along with that, obviously the mechanisms need to be put in place for oversight of how loss and damage would work. And there's a whole network that has been talked about and negotiated at a few COPs now, and it really needs to be operationalized, have an effective mechanism put in place so they can really provide the technical assistance that we need to really support vulnerable countries like ourselves and other developing countries. And of course, we need to ensure that this mechanism is thinking about how funds and all this technical assistance actually gets to the local level and meets the needs of frontline communities and the most vulnerable. And then last but not least, we really need to think about the just transition and what that means for our workforce and how we're really providing decent and safe work for all. And I think that's a really important issue from a youth perspective, because many of you are now starting your careers and thinking about, well, what am I going to do? Where are the jobs? How do I make sure I have the skills to get into new blue economy, green economy sectors, etc. And we really need to think about what's happening there. And in addition to that, we need to think about how we reorient our development model to just be much more focused on clean renewable technologies, being much more efficient, looking at how we make sure we have sustainable food systems, agricultural systems. And I think as part of this, one of the things that we've been talking about is ensuring that people remember that small and micro enterprises, which make up maybe like 70% of our local economies in many of our islands, are a really important pathway to promoting this new sort of inclusive, sustainable, resilient development. And we need to recognize and support them to do this. And so this is an important part of the just transition as well. And then finally, we need to think about bigger things like what we do with our trade, what we do with our investment, including thinking about, how COVID-19 recovery and the billions of dollars we're spending on this is helping us to actually shift towards this just transition as opposed to continuing on business as usual. And as I've said with a lot of other things, we need to ensure that there's engagement of civil society, of the most vulnerable, those in the front lines, the enterprises that I just talked about, SMEs, in setting the development priorities and really tracking implementation and the progress that's being achieved so that there's real transparency.
Climate justice today.
So I think with that, those are our 5 priorities. And really the last thing that I think is important to note in terms of what we're calling for is we're also calling for a rights-based approach in addressing all 5 of these priority areas and really helping us to promote and ensure climate justice. And one of the reasons we're doing that is a rights-based framework really gives us that moral and legal basis to really demand that there's actions to protect human rights that are being impacted by climate change. And this has been recognized by some recent landmark hearings. And that to be really ensuring the protection also of our natural environment and resources that we depend on. And so this is, I think, a really important thing to think about. So think about the rights of future generations, our rights to a healthy environment, the right to self-determination, and the rights of various vulnerable groups, from women to youth to elderly, persons with disabilities, etc. We really need to factor that in and recognize that international human rights standards and the obligations that we have, combined with things like the 2030 Agenda and Sustainable Development Goals, can really provide a good framework for us to think about how we can combat climate change and ensure the protection of rights and justice, in a real way. So I think with that, I'm going to wrap up. And if you have any questions on the Alliance, the work that we're doing, I'm happy to answer them briefly. I realize we're running out of time. And you can also look out for our official release of our COP27 statement later this week.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grandison. Again, a very detailed overview of some of the priorities. And there's this matter of trying to condense these presentations. I know it's hard because even with the time constraints, I think it's still so very important that we get the fulsome content of these conversations, what are the priorities? So we fully understand what the nuances are, across these thematic areas for the different groups. And as I said earlier, I believe it also serves as a very important launching pad for the conversations that you're about to have in the breakout groups. Climate change has now become a very personal and immediate issue that we're treating with. It's no longer something abstract and far-fetched and down the road, 100 years away reality. And so I ask that you bear that in mind as you have these conversations about what these priorities are, but also don't just think about what your immediate personal concerns are, but your wider community. Who are the fisher folk that what are their issues, youth fisher folk, the young people who have an interest in engineering and renewable energy and what that space might look like as we shift from ICE vehicles to EVs with some of these very ambitious targets that our countries have of phasing out fossil fuels by 2040. How feasible is that objective even, that target? So begin to kind of dig deeper into these issues. But I know that we might have one or two questions for Dr. Grandison, and I want to give whoever has a burning question an opportunity to ask that, or just a comment if needs be, but you have to post in the chat. We are very mindful of the fact that we are clearly attracting hackers. Dr. Grandison, you did well. You were so composed. I'm glad I was not presenting because I'd have fallen off my chair. You just came back like nothing had happened. We'd be happy to pose it, but you just have to type it in the chat at this point. I'm not seeing anything, but feel free as you we have a little bit of time, so if you want to think a little bit more about it. But again, a very comprehensive overview, and I believe that the Caribbean is well placed and positioned at this point, with Canary leading this effort, and to really get the voice and the perspectives of Caribbean actors and citizens into the conversation. And again, that is why this now becomes so important. Dizan, can you lock back the meeting, relock the meeting? Thank you. All right, so this is part of what happens when you have, important convenings, then you attract hackers, and we will not be diverted and distracted from the cause that we are supporting in the meeting. So we'll just fix that, and we'll be okay. So Design has locked the meeting again, so we should not be subject to any more unwelcome participants. All right, so at this point, we are going to be going into the meat of the matter, I will call it, which is the breakout room or breakout group conversations. And so we're going to have, Naravni says, great presentation, Dr. Grandison, thank you. I echo the sentiments. We're going to be breaking the participants, putting participants in groups based on the thematic areas. And again, Dr. Grandison would have outlined some of those broad thematic areas and broad priority areas for the Caribbean. And so as we have them here, we have facilitators from CYEN, partners in this process from YPAC and from Girls Care, who are supporting. So we're going to ask our facilitators, Keisha Ann from CYN and Ivana from CYN as well, Tanique Heslop, who is affiliated with Girls Care, Christine Samoru from the Breadfruit Collective, and Cordisair and Naravni from the Caribbean Youth Climate Justice Coalition to lead these conversations. And so Dizan, I believe you are coordinating this process where individuals will be placed in these groups and the facilitators will support the kind of teasing out of the ideas and the recommendations, just, having conversations about what these concerns are, what your concerns are, specifically in relation to these core areas. So let me just outline again. Keisha Ann will be facilitating the conversations on climate justice. Ivana will be facilitating the conversation on loss and damage. Tanique Heslop will be facilitating the conversation on climate finance. Christine on mitigation, and Cordicer and Ravni on adaptation. So Dizan, if at any point you need me to stop talking so you can do what you need to do, let me know.
Yes, so you should be getting that notification now, everyone, to join the room. So I'm gonna open up the rooms right now.
In the meantime, can I play the jingle?
Yes, please, John. Yes. So yes, John will be playing that CYN jingle, climate justice jingle.
Perhaps we play the jingle when they come back because they've already been invited to the rooms.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay, no problem.